All right, tonight we're going to tackle 8.5 and 8.6 together and talk about some decolonization in the post World War II years and a couple of the newly independent states after World War II and some of the issues that come with that. So we've got a lot that you need to know within the theme of governance here. We've got nationalist leaders and parties in both Asia and Africa that are seeking autonomy either within or independence from imperial rule. After World War II, we're going to see some states get their independence through negotiated settlements, while others are going to get their independence through armed struggle. We're going to see sometimes regional, religious, or ethnic movements that will challenge colonial rule and the boundaries that they inherited from their previous colonial states. And some movements within those regions are going to advocate for autonomy. We're going to see the redrawing of some political boundaries of former colonial states that will lead to the creation of new states. And then finally, the redrawing of some of those boundary lines can lead to conflict as well as population displacement, refugees needing to move from one place or another, or populations willingly choosing to move, including those related to the partition of India and the creation of the nation of Israel. We're going to start with India and Pakistan. The push for Indian self-rule began as late as the late 19th century, or as early as the late 19th century, with the Indian National Congress, a united movement of Hindus and Muslims in India that advocated for more autonomy from the British. By the 1920s, this organization is going to be led by Mohandas Gandhi, who advocated the use of civil disobedience in support of gaining independence. Civil disobedience is essentially breaking laws that you felt were unjust, but not being violent and not striking against the British, letting them be seen as the more aggressive party. And this was ultimately very successful in moving India towards a path of independence. Now, there's another group in India called the Muslim League that's formed in 1906 that's also advocating for independence from Britain, but as a separate nation for South Asia's Muslim population. The Muslims in South Asia, in the British colony, didn't feel that they would be given a fair shake in a country that would have been dominated by a Hindu population. After World War II, Indian protests against British rule are going to grow, and Britain, like other countries after World War II, just aren't in as strong a position after the war to hold on to their colony. And so Britain will negotiate an end to their colonial rule in South Asia. By 1947, we're going to see two states formed, one India with a Hindu majority, and Pakistan, a Muslim majority, that would be formed out of that British colony. In the convening years, we're going to see a number of border conflicts, sometimes erupting into full-scale war, with massive migration moving between those two states, of many Muslims moving into Pakistan, many Hindus and Sikhs moving into India from Pakistan. In Africa, we've got a lot of different examples of independence movements in Africa. The British, for example, will work with many of their African colonies and negotiate an end to their imperialism by the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Ghana, one of the first, led by Kwame Nkrumah, will gain their independence from Britain through a negotiated settlement in 1957. The French will negotiate an end to imperialism with their West African colonies, including Senegal and the Ivory Coast. But we have a different story in Algeria, where the French are less willing to give up control in Algeria, as there were many French settlers, white French settlers, that lived along the Mediterranean coast of Algeria. France is going to fight to hold on to their Algerian colony, and this is going to be a violent war that will ultimately result in Algerian independence by 1962. We see a similar case in Vietnam. Like Algeria, the French were not willing to give up control of Vietnam following World War II. This is also taking place in light of the Cold War situation, and the United States did not support Vietnamese independence after World War II. From 1945 to 1954, the French will fight and lose a violent war against communist nationalist forces in Vietnam, led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. Following independence of Vietnam and its separation into two nations, a North Vietnam that was communist and a South Vietnam that was supported by the French and then the Americans, the United States would enter into the region to try to prevent the spread of communism from the North into the South. This becomes one of those proxy wars, as both the Soviet Union and China will support North Vietnam in this conflict against South Vietnam and the United States. This war will continue until 1975, when Vietnam will be united under communist government and the South will be defeated. Now, talking about a more regional issue of ethnic group that is looking for a separation from a larger nation, it's going to be in the French Canadian province of Quebec, where many French Catholics are advocating for a separate independent state from English speaking Canada. Following the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, and this is a movement in Quebec where new ideas of social and economic reforms were supported, and many people in Quebec, known as the Quebecois, advocated for nationalist desires and separation from the wider Canada. This movement sometimes resorted to political violence, including terrorist bombings, in their quest for independence, but this was never achieved. And as late as the 1980s, there were referendums that were held, votes of the people. Did they want to break from Canada? And ultimately, these referendums failed. Now, back to the Middle East, we've got Palestine in the Eastern Mediterranean that had been a mandate of the British since the end of World War I. It was one of these League of Nations mandates after the end of the First World War. In the years since the end of World War I, large numbers of Jewish migrants moved into Palestine in hopes of creating a national homeland. After World War II, even more Jewish migrants moved into Palestine and advocated for independence from Britain. Following some Zionist, this is Jewish nationalist terrorist attacks against the British are going to hand the question of Palestine over to the United Nations, who decides that this region should ultimately be divided between an Israeli state and a Palestinian Arab state into two countries, Israel, Palestine. Arabs, for their part, were frustrated with this outcome because they didn't think they needed to give up any territory to an Israeli state. And soon after this partition plan was announced and Israel declared its independence, a wider war between the new Israel and the Arab nations surrounding it would break out. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians would be displaced during this war that Israel ultimately won and ended up taking up even more land, and that Palestinian Arab state would never actually be formed. Going into the 1950s and 60s and 70s, three subsequent wars would be fought between Israel and their Arab neighbors, which grew the nation of Israel even larger and created even more of a refugee crisis for the Palestinians. In Cambodia, in Southeast Asia, after World War II, Cambodia is going to receive independence from France, I should say, from France in 1953. Following the violence of the Vietnam War, though, right next door, a radical communist group called the Khmer Rouge came to power in Cambodia, led by Pol Pot, and then they launched its genocidal attack against any opposition to their communist government. When all was said and done, a quarter of the Cambodian population was murdered by the Khmer Rouge. This new government was so radical and so extreme, the communist government next door in Vietnam actually would invade Cambodia to remove the Khmer Rouge from power and install a more reasonable and stable government, and they did that by 1979. So what do we want to take from this big section? Decolonization is going to take place throughout Africa and Asia after World War II, sometimes through negotiated settlements, sometimes through violent conflicts. Independence will often result in continued conflicts, and ethnic divisions and border disputes will lead to more violence. And violence in newly independent states will often lead to displacement of populations as refugees. We'll talk to you next time.